if you're sleeping about 8 hours or so, REM and deep should be about equal. Whereas your light sleep, remember that's the alpha and the theta, the light and deeper sleep should be about 4 hours. Last time we had kind of talked about sleep stages, in particular, what are the main sleep stages, what is the appropriate time that you need to be in each one, and what really are the differences between the stages. So whenever you think about sleep, you really want to think about four different stages. There's non-REM sleep and there's REM sleep, and non-REM sleep is associated with three different stages: light sleep, a deeper set of sleep, and deep sleep. And deep sleep is really the stage of sleep that we're most focused on, because that's where you tend to get a lot of the protein turnover, as well as the hormone regulation, as well as some of the important changes that are key in converting short-term memory to long-term memory. And there's a great graphic here that kind of gives you a good overview of this. As you can see, this graphic kind of talks about the main ideas between the different stages: stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. So stage 1 is the lightest sleep. And if you guys are familiar with EEG or waveforms, this is when you are in an alpha waveform, and we'll talk about that in terms of the frequency. Stage 2 would be where you're in a theta frequency, which is a slightly slower. Stage 3 is where you're in a delta frequency, which is the slowest frequency. And then stage 4 is when you're in REM sleep. So just to reiterate about the different stages here, so this is just an EEG, so an electroencephalogram, and it basically looks at electrical discharges in your brain while you're sleeping, right? And that's where some of the information in regards to alpha, theta, and delta waves come into place, right? Because they kind of refer to the waveforms that are present on EEG when you're sleeping. So when you're awake, you have a beta frequency, which is a very, as you can see, this time period is actually inaccurate, but it's somewhere between, it's usually greater than 15 cycles, 15 oscillations across the baseline per second. Whereas when you're in alpha, that's something between 7 and 14. When you're in theta, it is 4 to, or 8 to 14 for alpha, 4 to 7 for theta. And then delta, we call it slow wave sleep because it's very slow, and you only get about 4 oscillations per second in delta. Another important thing to point out is you get these large fluctuations in delta, indicating large electrical discharges. So there's a lot of really important turnover and helpful actions that occur when you're in delta sleep. And then this picture right here kind of gives you an idea of how we transcend between the different stages. So this yellow bar kind of is indicative of when we are awake. And as you can see, this on the x-axis, you'll see hours of sleep, and the y-axis, you see the stages, right? And so some of you may already be aware of this, but during different cycles of sleep, we actually wake up for very short periods of time, right? So initially you're awake, and then you go to N1, which is the alpha state or light sleep, where you're closing your eyelids, but you're still somewhat awake. Stage 2 is where you're a little bit deeper, but you are immediately arousable. And then stage 3 is where it's deep sleep, right? And as you can see, throughout the night, you go into several different stages. You'll slowly go into deep sleep for a period of time, and then move up to REM sleep. So you go awake, light, deeper, deep sleep, and then REM sleep. REM sleep, of course, is when you're dreaming. That actually is associated with a lot of electrical activity. And then once you are done with that portion of the dream, you go back into a deeper stage. So deeper, and then deep sleep. So theta and delta waves, and then back to REM. And then you might wake up for a short period of time and then go back into REM sleep, a lighter sleep, and then deeper sleep, and then awake. And as you can see, over the course of the night, you really get most of your restorative cycles earlier in the night, and then it gets lighter and lighter as you wake. Another thing to point out is each one of these cycles, most of us have 4 to 5 cycles a night of sleep, and each one of these cycles is 90 to 120 minutes, right? In each cycle, you'll careen between these different stages. And I am a fan of the Oura Ring, but there are many other forms in which you can look at your sleep stages. What's cool about the Aura Ring is it'll give you an idea of where you are, how much time you keep in these stages, right? The important thing to look at is not so much to say, well, hey, my deep sleep or my light sleep is much worse than my friends or than what's considered to be average, but rather is it improving over time? Ideally, if you were to make a pie chart and look at your sleep, you would want your light and deeper sleep, that is your alpha and theta sleep, to be about 50% of the pie, your deep sleep to be about a quarter, and your REM sleep to be about a quarter. So if you're sleeping about 8 hours or so, REM and deep should be about equal, whereas your light sleep, remember that's the alpha and the theta, the light and deeper sleep should be about 4 hours. And as you can see that the course of the night, that's how it works. What I would do is, provided you're making interventions to improve your sleep, monitor it. An Aura Ring is a great way to measure this, but there are other markers like the Whoop bracelet, and there are many Apple wearables that do as well. But the Aura is the one that's been around on the market and seems to be the biggest one out there. So first of all, why is it so important that you maximize that delta or deep or slow wave sleep, right? Why is it so key? Well, it appears in most research that is the most important stage, because that's really where you see a lot of the protein turnover in the brain, neural maturation. So many times there are cells growing. I mean, even though there are some individuals who feel that the amount of neurons you have may be static after, birth, that may not necessarily be true. There's evidence that suggests you can grow new neurons throughout life. But definitely the supportive cells like the oligodendrocytes, the macrophages, some of the fibroblasts, fibrocytes, those are definitely changeable, and those are very important in the functioning of your brain and the circuitry. Also, what's important is during this time period, you tend to convert your short-term memory to long-term memory. As a student, I remember this being very important when I was studying for exams, because I recognized I would remember as well as do better on exams after sleeping for decent periods of time. I didn't put two and two together and be like, well, it's probably my deep sleep. I just recognized it helped, right? But that's probably part of the reason. Another thing to keep in mind is it really seems to help with ATP turnover, as well as improving glucose utilization within the brain, which is obviously going to be important. You want your mitochondria to function appropriately and allow the neurons to secrete neurotransmitters and send those signals as fast as possible. So it's really key to keep this amount appropriate. What if, unfortunately, your deep sleep is not appropriate? So it's not about a quarter of your total sleep, right? And it is well underneath that 1.5 to 2 hours. What can you do maybe to improve that? The best things to do to improve that would be really to improve your sleep as a whole. And the way I like to divide it is I like to look at it in terms of 3 or 4 different things. So the first thing I like to look at is primarily your sleep habits, so your sleep hygiene, right? And so all of us are guilty of this stuff at one point or another. Basically, there'll be time periods where we'll have difficulty getting to sleep at an appropriate time. It does appear best, particularly if you are not working like on a night schedule. If you want to, you really want to sleep in tune with your body's natural circadian rhythms, right? Which these are, of course, are the physiologic cycles that correlate with natural light as well as the absence of it throughout the day. And ideally, going to bed somewhere between 9 to 10:30 at night is probably the best thing if you are, of course, on a typical schedule. So trying to go to bed around that time period or no later than 10:30 would be a good idea. Once you're doing that, the key thing to remember is set your bedtime at a certain time and keep it constant. If you can do that, you're more likely to get into a set routine, get those cycles stabilized. If you are finding that you are fluctuating between bedtimes, you're also going to obviously disrupt those circadian rhythms, and you might encounter something like a second wind. So This is something I didn't really recognize, but sometimes, when I have a really busy day, I'll notice that I will feel really tired around 9 or 10 p.m. And then I'll find that I will feel really exhausted, but I'll kind of push through and then I'll get a second wind around like 11 or 12 a.m. And I mistakenly misconstrued that as just like, well, I guess I'm going to work through it. I have extra inspiration, so it should be good, right? The reality, though, is what that really means is you've kind of lost that window, that sleep window of sleep, and you're now moving into disrupting your circadian rhythms. And so everyone knows what that feels like. You're going to be in a situation where you're going to be tired during the day and you need to take naps during the day rather than having a restful sleep. So try to keep that bedtime around that 9 to 10:30 period. Keep your bedroom primarily for sleep and for sex, right? Outside of those activities, it's probably not a good idea to watch TV and play video games, whatever people eat. I don't know. Try to keep it just for those two activities. If you must read, it's okay, but try to do it with a light that's not a blue light, because blue light, unfortunately, it kind of tricks your brain into thinking that it's light outside, and so it keeps you awake. So try to avoid blue light or use blue light blockers. The other thing to keep in mind is that exercise, it's kind of controversial. There's been some studies that have suggested that exercise can be helpful for certain individuals, where others have suggested that it actually stimulates you. I am of the opinion that, particularly if it's weight training, it's probably not in your best interest to train 2 to 3 hours prior to sleep, because it does seem to release catecholamines, and that certainly can disrupt your sleep. So I would try to get it done earlier if at all possible. If that's the only time you can work out, it is what it is, right? But if you can try to find a different period, it's probably a little bit better. Another thing to realize is the type of food that you eat can make a big difference. So if you eat a lot of carbohydrates, you're going to get fluctuation in your insulin levels, right? And that in turn can lead to lower blood sugar, and that can disrupt your sleep cycles. So it's better to have a diet that's higher in protein and moderate carb, maybe 20 to 13% of your macros, if you have small macros, and less protein less carbs towards the end of the day. This in turn will keep your insulin levels pretty stable and lead to less blood sugar fluctuations. We all know to decrease stimulants, what I typically recommend is to try to stop utilizing stimulants like caffeine. Don't utilize them any later than 12 to 1 p.m. But if you are someone that has a lot of trouble with maintaining sleep, you may need to stop them even earlier, maybe like 9 or 10. It's an experiment. You guys have to kind of try it out, but see how it goes. I'm usually okay with using them up until about noon or so, but depending on your sensitivity, it can be worse. And then utilizing a blue light blocker is a good idea, either the glasses or there's a program that we had mentioned in the past called Flux that you can download for your computer that seems to help a whole bunch in reducing blue light. You want your computer or whatever electronic device you're utilizing later in the day to broadcast an orange hue, right, rather than the blue light that's broadcast off the screen. And again, it's because blue light's going to trick your brain into thinking that it's daytime and make it less likely that you're going to get ready to sleep. One of my favorite things to do is keeping the room cold. There's a lot of data suggesting that the cooler the room, the cooler the area, the better off your sleep will be. I'm a little bit on the extreme side. I'll keep my room closer to 62 degrees Fahrenheit. That may or may not be a possibility for some individuals. If you're in a situation, perhaps where your wife or girlfriend or your bed partner doesn't tolerate cold temperatures well, there are certain cooling devices you can put on your mattress, such as, I think it's called a chili pad. I know that there are a lot of mattresses that are coming out that, like the Sleep Number mattresses that Sealy, I guess, used to put out. They're now moving towards cooling mattresses where it's cool one side or the other. And then finally, supplements, right? And so what I want to emphasize is really try to improve your hygiene first, because the supplements will improve and will help your sleep cycles, but do the easy stuff first. Focus on the hygiene. And once that is optimized, the following may be a benefit. So, as a member of the clinic, hormonal changes are going to be optimized because we're going to be checking labs. I can say with 100% certainty if your test levels, DHEA, your estrogen, cortisol levels, if they're off, you are going to have affected sleep cycles. And the best way, of course, to fix these would be just to get labs, meet with me, we can adjust them. If your levels are optimized, though, some supplements that can help, provided, of course, your hygiene is appropriate, would be the following: melatonin, tryptophan, magnesium, valerian, all of which have been associated with increasing deep sleep levels, as well as decreasing the onset of time that it takes to go from lighter stages of sleep, that's the alpha, as well as the delta stages to the deep sleep. It actually decreases that time. And so definitely would suggest utilizing them. Some of the dosing, magnesium is really popular. Magnesium glycinate, which is part of the VitaPack, 300 milligrams work well. We have the sleep stack in the clinic that contains many of these items: valerian, ashwagandha, chamomile, as well as lemon balm. That's all included in the sleep stack, and that might be of utility to you if you're still having trouble with sleep. And then finally, the last thing are growth hormone enhancers. We have both growth hormone secretagogues as well as actual growth hormone, and those definitely will increase the amount of deep sleep that you have. And so utilizing those at night would be a good idea. So, just to recap, if you're concerned about the stages for sleep, ideally about a quarter. Typically, you want 25% of your sleep cycle to be in the deep sleep. And that can vary from person to person. And remember, it's all about seeing if you're better than the person you were a few weeks ago, a few months ago. Don't compare yourself to others or other ideals. Just try to compare yourself in terms of improving yourself. But about approximately 25% of your sleep should be in deep sleep. We kind of talked about why deep sleep is important: protein turnover, neuronal synthesis, cementing those short-term memories into long-term memories. And then finally, we talked about those interventions to improve your deep sleep, primarily focus on hygiene, right? Avoiding the blue light, keeping the room cold, avoiding stimulants, and then maybe considering supplements, GH, and of course, the sleep stack maybe are the easiest ways to improve that. And of course, setting up an appointment with me if you are unsure about your hormonal optimization.